Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 3, The Dream Warriors. The Novelization, Chapter 3. Nancy didn't especially like Kristen's mother, and she knew at once that the feeling was certainly entirely mutual. What was it about people with money that made them so insensitive to their children's needs? Of course, Nancy knew it wasn't fair to overgeneralize in a case like this. She had known rich people before, who were excellent parents too, but there seemed to be a whole lot of people out there like the Parkers, who seemed to think that buying expensive presents for their kids was all it took to qualify them for Parent of the Year. "Frankly," said Mrs. Parker, quickly signing the hospital admitting forms that Nancy had brought to her home, "I can't help thinking that this whole thing has been blown way out of proportion. Kristen has always been a child who sought attention, and now she's got it, doesn't she? Well, she's not going to get it from me."
"I'm sure of that,"
muttered Nancy. "Pardon me?" asked Miss Parker.
"Nothing. Was Kristen acting any different before she made the attempt on her life?"
"Not that I'd noticed. But then I've been rather busy lately." Mrs. Parker sighed and straightened a cushion on her exquisite leather couch. "After all, one has one's responsibility to one's community, hasn't one?" Nancy clenched the arm of her chair and refrained from answering the woman's rhetorical question. This was neither the time nor the place to lecture Mrs. Parker on where her primary responsibilities lay.
"Did she have any nightmares that you know of?"
Nancy asked. "Only when I took away her charge cards," Mrs. Parker replied with an unpleasant smile. "I really don't see what you want from me."
"What I want from you?"
Nancy stopped herself and took a deep breath.
"I'm just looking for some answers. It's not just Kristen, Miss Parker. There's been other kids, good kids, with serious problems. I'm just trying to help them."
Before Mrs. Parker could reply, her husband abruptly entered the room. Nancy was sure that the well-tanned man in the expensive tennis outfit had been listening in from the next room. "It was nice of you to bring the papers here, Miss Thompson," he said. "But if everything is arranged for Kristen's stay in the hospital, we really must be getting to the club." "My first tennis tournament," said Mrs. Parker brightly.
"How nice,"
said Nancy through clenched teeth. She checked the papers in her hand and saw that everything had been properly signed. There seemed no point in continuing the conversation.
"Are Kristen's clothes ready?"
"Why, of course," said Mrs. Parker. "Teresa said there was a suitcase ready in her room." Mrs. Parker called out for the maid, but there was no immediate reply. "Siesta time, I suppose," she muttered in disgust.
"I'll go up and get it, if that's all right,"
said Nancy, curious to see Kristen's room. "Well, it's the first door on the left." Mrs. Parker gestured vaguely toward the stairs. "Please be quick about it, though." Nancy nodded and walked briskly up the marbled stairway. Kristen's room looked very much like the room of any girl her age, with a casual warmth and sense of humor to it that was conspicuously absent from her mother's expensively furnished living room. Nancy picked up the fine leather suitcase from the bed and was about to leave when she noticed the model house on the table across from Kristen's bed. Then she blinked her eyes and looked again. The doll-sized house on Kristen's table was a perfect replica of Nancy's old house on Elm Street. Nancy stared at the house for a long moment before crossing the room for a closer look. Granted, there were a few small differences. The color was all wrong, and there was a tiny sign over the front door that read, Hathaway House. Still, there was no doubt in Nancy's mind that this was an incredibly accurate scale model of the house she had lived in for most of her life. The house her mother had died in only a few short years ago when Nancy closed her eyes and forced herself not to think about it. She tucked the model under one arm, picked up the suitcase, and climbed back down the stairs.
Kristen asked me to bring this.
She lied. Doesn't surprise us, said Mrs. Parker, now looking slightly ridiculous in her tennis whites. The girl's been obsessed with that thing for weeks now. Frankly, I didn't even know she was interested in architecture. There are a lot of things we both don't know about your daughter, thought Nancy, as she said goodbye and headed back to the hospital. About those pills, Neil said as he walked with Nancy toward the group therapy room.
What pills are those?
She asked, although she knew exactly which pills he was referring to. The Hypnosil, said Neil. Nancy shrugged.
What about them?
She asked, Who prescribed them to you, Nancy? Do you understand? Did you know that they're still considered experimental?
Don't worry about it. I'm not taking them anymore. Damn thing stopped working.
Before Neil could ask any more questions, Nancy joined Dr. Madalena and the kids from the ward in the group therapy room. She ignored the older woman's dirty looks and sat down on one of the chairs that had been arranged in a circle in the middle of the room. Nancy had never seen such a weary-looking group of teenagers before. I hope to get to know each of you individually over the course of the next few days, said Neil, sitting down in the last of the empty chairs. You all know Dr. Madalena, of course. Now, the young lady to my left is our newest staff member, Nancy Thompson. My name is Neil. Before we get started, why don't we all just introduce ourselves? Fuck this, said Kincaid, leaning forward belligerently in his chair. Do you have a middle name, or do we just call you Mr. This? Asked Neil. Everyone laughed, and even Kincaid seemed to relax a little. Kincaid, he said, leaning back with a grin.
My name is Taryn,
said a pretty 15-year-old girl with chocolate-brown skin.
I am fire.
In this kingdom, I am called Laredo, said the boy sitting next to her. Here, I am flesh. There, metal, rope, and ectoplasm. Jennifer, said a blonde girl of about 16. Neil found her brief answer curiously refreshing. He waited a moment for the withdrawn-looking boy sitting next to Jennifer to speak, and then asked him his name. That's Joey, said Jennifer. He doesn't talk. He used to be a debater in school, but he hasn't spoken to anyone since he's been here. Neil nodded and turned to the last boy in the group, who identified himself as Philip. I walk in my sleep, the boy added. He opened his mouth as if he were going to say more, but then shook his head and looked away. Well, it's good to meet all of you, said Neil. I know it's late and we're all tired, but I'd like to try an experiment before we call it a night. Has anyone ever been hypnotized? More bullshit, said Kincaid. Does it scare you, Kincaid? Asked Neil. Nothing scares a brother of the dream, said Laredo. Neil smiled weakly and nodded his head. You've all had bad dreams, he continued, and it's my belief. I think some of you are having trouble remembering exactly what the dreams have been about. If we can just get a handle on your nightmares, I'd like to try, said Kristen. Good, said Neil, glancing briefly at Dr. Madalena before continuing. I'd like you to close your eyes now, Kristen. Just listen to my voice and relax. Forget about everything but the sound of my voice. Let the walls of the room fall away. There's nothing here but you and the sound of my voice. Now, as you begin to relax, I want you to remember. Remember what happened before you tried to hurt yourself. I'm going to start counting backwards from 5 down to 0. And when I reach 0, I want you to tell me exactly what happened that day. Kristen nodded, her breathing slow and regular. Okay, Kristen, I'm going to start counting now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I'm doing my homework, said Kristen, her eyes now lightly closed and her features perfectly relaxed. It's late and I'm really tired. I fall asleep and now I'm in the dream. I can see the house. There's a terrible smell. Go on, said Neil, surprised to see that the others had also closed their eyes and were nodding in agreement. It's his face, said Kristen, her voice trembling slightly. It's all burned and scarred, and he's after me. He says he's going to hurt me real bad. I won't let him. I'll wake up. Listen to me, Kristen, said Neil, alarmed by the terror in the girl's trembling voice. I'm going to count backwards again. He's hurting the children, shouted Kristen.
I'll get him,
said Taryn, her eyes shut tight.
I'll burn him with my fire.
I need help, shouted Jennifer. Don't worry, said Laredo. With my golden sword shall I slay the wicked one. Grab onto my legs, said Kincaid, his eyes still closed as he leaped to his feet. I'll fly us to safety. Look out for the claw, warned Philip. Motherfucker! Screamed Joey, diving across the room at some invisible assailant. Nancy watched in silence as Neil and Dr. Madalena attempted to restore some semblance of order. It wasn't until Kristen abruptly vomited that the spell seemed to be broken. In that instant, all eyes opened, and the 6 young people fell back to their seats, totally exhausted. Nancy had the strangest feeling that she could have helped them, if only she had dared to close her own eyes.
Are you okay?
Whispered Nancy. Kristen sat up in her hospital bed and nodded her head. Getting better, she replied, speaking softly so as not to disturb Taryn, who slept peacefully in her bed across the room.
I brought you something from home.
Nancy sat the model house down on the girl's nightstand. Kristen looked at the model for a long moment before turning back to Nancy. Why did you bring that? She asked.
Why did you make it?
Answered Nancy. Kristen shrugged and averted her eyes. Maybe I want to be an architect, she said.
Maybe. But why this particular house?
I just made it up, said Kristen. It's not anything special. It's not a special house.
It's special to me.
Said Nancy.
I grew up in this house. Right near here. On Elm Street.
Kristen stared at her in genuine bewilderment. But this is the house I dreamed about, she said.
When did you first see it?
Nancy asked. I've never seen it, said Kristen, except in my dreams. Nancy stared at the girl for a very long moment, and then shook her head slowly from side to side.
I had a dream the other night.
Nancy began. I know, said Kristen. I meant to thank you for that.
Are you saying...
It really happened, said Kristen. I pulled you into my dream. That's my gift.
Your gift?
Echoed Nancy, trying to make sense out of the girl's words. All the kids have gifts, said Kristen. I think that's why we've survived this long.
Did you ever do anything like that before?
Asked Nancy, still trying to grab on to the awesome implications of being pulled inside someone else's dream. Just with my brother, said Kristen. When I was little, sometimes I'd make him help me when I was having a bad dream. He never remembered anything in the morning, though. I was never really sure it had happened. That is, until now.
The man who was chasing us,
said Nancy, her mouth suddenly very dry.
Have you dreamed of him before?
I think so, said Kristen, paling slightly. It's hard to remember.
I know.
Nancy said as she gently placed a hand on Kristen's forearm.
Why do you keep dreaming? The others have stopped.
I always thought I could get away, said Kristen. Now, I'm not so sure.
Do you think?
Said Nancy, involuntarily tightening her grip on the girl's arm.
Do you think you could pull him out of a dream? The way you pulled me in?
No way, said Kristen, suddenly releasing herself from Nancy's grip. I don't ever want to see that creep again.
I'm afraid,
said Nancy with a sigh.
You may not have any choice about that.
Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 3 of A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, The Dream Warriors, the novelization of the movie by Jeffrey Cooper. Gotta say, I'm really digging this book. Really happy to have two of my $15 patrons back on board voicing roles in this book as well. That's Cecilia Spears playing Nancy and Bonanza Jellybean playing Taryn. And, I'm noticing some differences between the movie and the book already, and I really love that when a book goes that route, because novelizations are fun to read, even if you've seen the movie 100 times. But when the author adds depth to the stories or makes some changes, gives you some extra stuff, it's really exciting because you're getting this experience of like one of your favorite horror movies, and you're getting to experience it like for the first time again and have new stuff to look forward to. So every chapter I do of this book, I'm excited about now, because I've heard before I got into it that there's quite a few differences between this novelization and the movie The Dream Warriors. Probably because the book is probably based on an earlier draft of the screenplay. That's why I skipped Part 2 for now. I am going to do A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. I'll probably do it next before I do, The Dream Master. But I was just so excited to get into this one, and I know you guys and gals were looking forward to Dream Warriors as well. And as far as tonight's chapter goes, I really love the relationship between Nancy and Kristen. It's like on one hand, Nancy feels for Kristen and wants to help her and protect these teens, but there's another part of Nancy that wouldn't mind using Kristen for bait to get her own personal revenge on Freddy for killing her mom. So it's like a battle of morals, inside of Nancy going on, and just really cool. We got to meet all the characters tonight in the room, and we got to meet Philip, and unless things are way different in the book than the movie, then I don't think he's long for this world. But I love that scene in the movies. In the movie, with the whole puppet walk and everything. And I really hope if there's something the book does keep from the movie, it's the puppet walk, because that's one of my favorite Freddy nightmare scenes in any of the movies. So I'm really looking forward to that. It was kind of cool to hear Joey screaming "motherfucker," in the whole scene. I love Laredo, man. Mr. Dungeons and Dragons himself. I love his character in the movie, and I'm excited to see if there's any differences added to, some more depth and stuff added to his character, because I always enjoyed his character. But in the movie, I never thought that he got a fair shake as far as having like a badass scene with Freddy, like the other Dream Warriors did. His magic missile really didn't do much against Freddy, and yes, I do know what magic missile is from D&D. Oh boy, yeah, I'm not just a horror nerd, I'll tell you that. But I'm hoping in this book he gets a little more offense against Freddy, because I'd love to see his imagination just give Freddy a run for his money before his death. Taryn's a little different, talking more about fire, and her description is a lot different than what's in the movie. Of course, I'm looking forward to Jennifer's big break in TV. There's just so much of this book that I'm looking forward to reading. Hope you guys are excited as I am about this one. I'll be back very soon with more of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and pleasant dreams!